Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Derek Panchuk. Derek, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Dan.
Really excited to have you on. We're going to be talking all things skill acquisition. We're going to be talking coaching science, a broad conversation around topics that as a sports psychologist, I'm really interested in. And as a greedy sports psychologist, I think we need to be heavily involved in as sports psychologists. But before we get on to any kind of conversation around those topics, I'd love to know more about you, Derek. So tell us a little bit about your work and tell us about yourself.
Oh, thanks, Dan. I did my PhD at the University of Calgary in the area of sort of visual perception and motor learning. When I finished, I moved down here to Australia off the back of that and was an academic in Melbourne for a few years before getting a great opportunity to work at the Australian Institute of Sport as their first ever national lead for skill acquisition, which meant I sort of got my hands dirty a little bit. So working on the tools, but also sort of thinking about skill acquisition more strategically. After a few years there, like any good government agency, they restructured, found myself sort of thinking about what was next. And what was next was the world of consulting, which I've sort of been doing for the last 6 years, spending time, essentially, I guess, working with coaches to help build bridges between the science of learning and the art of coaching so that they can discover new ways to develop talent in teams. Do lots of different stuff, but I would say the main thing is I spend my time watching coaches coach and then talking shop with them about, how we can squeeze more learning into those environments, maybe think about different ways of doing things.
The world of consultancy, scary but fun.
Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about your sort of sporting background. I mean, what was your undergrad and your postgrad topics, and what areas of sport did you play or coach or compete in any respect?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, obviously being Canadian, it was sort of hard to escape ice hockey. And so I spent a good part of my youth into my early adulthood playing ice hockey. Was sort of a player who was a late bloomer, I was good enough and played on some decent teams, but sort of by the time I started getting good, it was probably a little bit too late for me to cut my teeth in that world. But I was also reasonably good academically. And so I ended up going to the University of Calgary, doing a bachelor's degree in kinesiology, and then was looking at options and suddenly realized that I had a real passion for this area of sort of motor learning, skill acquisition. Got talked into doing my master's there, where I studied the visual perception of ice hockey goaltenders, and that led into a PhD in sort of the same topic as well, just looking at how performance and vision are related to one another, and how we can kind of use that information to get better at the things that we do. I sort of think there's a whole side of performance that we're not really looking at when we're sort of talking about perception and action. In terms of sports, obviously I played ice hockey, coached ice hockey, also spent some time coaching Canadian football, which is a lot like gridiron or American football. And I would sort of say that's kind of evolved from coaching sports and athletes to coaching coaches now.
Visual perception of ice hockey goaltenders. Tell me about that. That has piqued my interest. Tell me a little bit about that study.
Yeah, well, I think it was one of the first studies to actually look at visual perception in ice hockey, sort of on ice with goaltenders actually saving pucks. It was pretty straightforward. We basically put an eye tracker on a goaltender, which at that time wasn't an easy feat, and we had to sort of build it into a helmet so that there was protection in place. But my supervisor, Joan Vickers, she was very adamant that we had to do things in the real world, and I'm glad she was sort of stuck to that idea because, we had some fun with that, and then basically looked at how goaltenders were watching the world and watching the play unfold as they were responding to shots from different distances. And, not surprisingly, goaltenders look at the puck when they need to save it. But what was really interesting was the fact that there was subtle differences in how long they looked at it for and how long they tracked it. So something called the quiet eye, which I'm sure a few of your listeners have heard of. For those that haven't, it's basically the last good look somebody has before they sort of execute a critical movement in their sport. And so that was the initial study. And then after that, we did some work looking at, what are the sources of information that goaltenders use to make saves, and sort of trying to do visual occlusion, which is basically taking away different parts of the shooter's body on ice, which was another fun challenge. But we sort of found that, prior to release. So if you were thinking like in soccer terms, for example, there's the run up and the kick. Well, in hockey, it's pretty much the same thing. There's sort of this sort of preparatory phase where you're kind of watching the shooter shoot. So that's really important for sort of setting the table, but then being able to track the puck is really important as well. And it's subtle differences. Like we're talking about, a few hundred milliseconds is the difference between generally a goaltender making a save or missing.
You've thrown out some big things there. You've thrown out a huge name in Joan Vickers, right? Absolutely ginormous name in the world, well, across sports science and sports psychology, I would say. A quiet eye. I'm interested in, as a sports psychologist, I'm interested in visual perception. And can you, let's take a little bit of a helicopter viewpoint here. Visual perception. Give us a bit of an introduction into this topic. Visual perception in sport.
I'd say basically, it's one of those things that I think we all kind of acknowledge that it's really important. So being able to see the right things at the right times not only is important for sport, but just our daily lives, right? So when you sort of think about it, try walking through the world with your eyes closed. You're probably going to be in a bit of trouble. So visual perception basically comes down to how we take in or perceive information and use that to coordinate and control actions. And so in the sports context, there's a lot of good research that we sort of look at that basically says that different performers look at the world differently. And as we get better at performing in our tasks, we sort of zoom in or focus in on things that are more relevant for what we're actually trying to achieve in that moment. And so, the study of visual perception basically starts to unpack what's relevant for performance, as well as how that links back to action, right? So we know that there's sort of the cyclical relationship between perception and action. So as we move through the world, the things we see change, and that influences what we do. And what we do then influences what we see. So it's almost sort of going in circles. And what's really interesting is that we can, with the work that I was introduced to through working with Joan, is with eye tracking, we can start to sort of unpack and uncover what great performers are seeing, and how that compares to people who maybe aren't so good or maybe learning skills for the first time, identify differences and then look for opportunities to train and improve that.
So eye tracking allows you to study the visual perception of competitors. What I feel I understood about what you said there was key is what they're looking at. That makes sense. And for how long they're looking at that stimulus or that piece of information. Would I be correct there? And the subtle differences between how long influences the anticipation and the actions that competitors are taking.
Yeah. That's I think a great summary, Dan. And essentially, that's sort of what we're looking for, right? Is it's just as much about what or where they're looking at, but when too. Like as sort of when people are performing, you think about like the really complex, cluttered, busy environments that sort of make up a lot of the sports that we're talking about here. Like information sort of presents itself and goes away in an instant. And so if you've missed it, you could miss an opportunity to do something. And so that's really what eye tracking starts to do. It lets us look at, how different people scan, perceive, anticipate, view the world around them. Essentially, it's a way to almost step in to the athlete's shoes and get a player's or athlete's eye view of what they think is important at different times in the game, or what they might be missing.
So what they're looking at, when they're looking at it, how long they're looking at it. So demonstrating my poor knowledge of ice hockey, I'll go to the one very, very famous player that I absolutely know played ice hockey, and that's Wayne Gretzky. A working hypothesis here is that what he was looking at was pretty optimal when he was looking at that information in his competitive environment, was pretty optimal, and for how long he was looking at it was pretty optimal in order to help him anticipate and make great decisions. If we're into football, soccer, we can consider the same about Lionel Messi in this instance. So, and again, I've used two stunningly obvious examples, but what we're invested in learning here is, rather than just saying, hey, Wayne Gretzky, Lionel Messi, these players they've just got it. They've got something that nobody else has got. You're kind of saying, hang on a minute here. I'm really interested in this. I think we could potentially learn how to coach this if we discover some of the key principles behind visual perception.
Spot on. And there's actually I love that you brought up Wayne Gretzky, because there's a great Wayne Gretzky quote where he says, I couldn't beat people with my strength. I don't have the hardest shot. I'm not the quickest skater in the league. My eyes and my mind have to do most of the work. And I love that, because I think we can all think about these athletes that we've seen in sports, and you've brought up two great examples who just see the game differently. And they're able to make connections and see things that other athletes can't. And that almost creates, an unfair competitive advantage for them, because, they don't have to be the quickest, because it's almost like they're 2 steps ahead of everyone else. Right. And so one of the really interesting things around the visual perception side of things is, okay, we know there's differences. That's great. But, vision is just like a muscle. It's something that can be trained and developed. And so we can teach people to improve their visual perception in different ways. It's probably not sort of, I guess, the conventional side of performance and coaching. But I certainly think there's a lot of untapped opportunities in that space that, people have been exploring for a little while, but I think there's some great challenges and opportunities to really, I guess, almost accelerate performance in some ways that haven't been looked at yet.
Well, let's, given that you're invested in this every single day and you're helping coaches to understand the research, the science, and apply this science, this research in their work. Let's take a working example of, and again, respecting he's a pretty obvious person here, but Lionel Messi. I suppose my first question is, can anybody become Lionel Messi? Big question there. And then really the broader conversation I'd rather have that interests me more is, how do we improve players' visual perception to get closer to where Lionel Messi is? Big questions, Derek. So apologies, but let's begin at the beginning wherever you can.
Yeah, well, it's a great question too, and I think there's never going to be a Lionel Messi, like there'll never be another Wayne Gretzky. There'll be players who are probably similar, but I guess the way I sort of look at performance is that it's a bit of a puzzle, and you've got different pieces that you're playing with, and so and everybody's puzzle's probably going to be a little bit different. So like he's probably got a unique blend of pieces that we might not ever see again. But we'll see other players who are probably pretty close who might go on to do better things. And, so a player like Wayne Gretzky, a player like Messi, who maybe aren't the most physically gifted, as I sort of mentioned in that quote, they can make up a lot of ground and maybe exceed people because they've got this piece of their puzzle is sort of maybe more geared towards the perceptual side of things, and that gives them an advantage. So I hopefully have sort of explained, I guess, my view on what that means. And so everybody's got a different ceiling. How much we can train that is probably one of the things that's we don't really know exactly how much of a contribution that makes to performance. Like, it's obviously a big part of it, but it's not the only thing. It's not a silver bullet by any stretch. But it's an area where, there's a lot of potential to try and tap into it because there's not a lot of people really sort of focusing on it. I know, in the world of football or soccer, this idea of scanning is something that's really big. And I've, watched coaches yell out scan, scan, scan during a play. But I think that's a little bit different than maybe taking more of a deliberate approach to training some of the perception stuff. It's maybe being a little bit more mindful about how we're designing those environments to actually promote scanning in different ways.
Well, I'd love you to unpack that for us because I think that's absolutely imperative for everybody listening in. You've mentioned something really interesting there. Scan, scan, scan can be the cry from the sidelines, but what I'm thinking there, in line with what you're saying, is it perhaps lacks a bit of meaning. So, how do you mentioned environments? So, how do people train visual perception?
Mm-hmm. I think part of it is first of all understanding, what are the sources of information that drive action in environments. So what's relevant for performance in different ways. So I think there's a level of understanding there, and that's going to vary depending on what sport we're talking about. And so recognizing what those are, and then try to build those into the different drills and activities that people are doing in training sessions, and then maybe changing the way that we're communicating information from coach to athlete, right? So, instead of, the intention of an activity to be, dribbling or carrying a puck or something like that, we maybe change the focus to, I want you to think about where you're looking here. What are we focusing on as we're doing things, or how do we get our heads up and keep scanning? Then can we build in aspects of that competitive, or no, aspects of from the competitive environment into that activity that promote that type of scanning behavior, and then maybe changing the way that we provide feedback, right? So if we're not interested in the physical performance, we're interested in what people are seeing, then we can ask questions around it. Okay, well, what did you see when that sort of play unfolded? Tell me about what you saw. Are there cues that you missed? I saw an opportunity here. Why didn't you see that? Or you did something that I wasn't really expecting. What was the driver for that? From like a visual standpoint, is sort of, so it's sort of, I guess, almost changing the conversations we're having around the activities that are designed slightly differently in terms of what we're trying to achieve.
I think it's really interesting. I'm going to reflect back some of the things you said there because I just think this is absolutely fantastic. It's, it starts with understanding in your specific sport, because you're going to have coaches from different sports listening in, what is relevant for performance, what sources of information are relevant for performance. That's where it starts. And obviously, if we're thinking of team sports, so much of that information is going to be in our environment, as play unfolds, the runs, the movements, the actions of teammates, of the opposition, relative to space and ball, etc., etc. And what you're saying there is we've got to take that and start considering that in terms of our activities, our drills, etc., etc. We've got to build them into, and then we've got to adjust our coach behaviors accordingly. So that adjustment might look a little bit more like guiding attention to spot cues and information and patterns that are emerging and dissolving as play unfolds. Those are the kind of things I'm hearing from you.
Yep. Yep.
And right. And so, do you think then, and I suppose this question leans towards the conversations you're having with coaches, do you think there then becomes a tension between visual perception training and the acquisition, whether you describe it as the acquisition of skill or the development of technique? You know, is there a tension there, do you think? Do you think we're pushing against sort of sporting cultural norms of, well, we just have to help them get technically good and we have to help them develop skill? Where does all that fit in? Is there a real tension there?
I would suggest that there is, in the sense that when we're focusing on technique, we tend to focus on one side of that perception action equation, right? So we're focusing on the action side of things, and almost in some ways sort of chasing perfect for that person, without necessarily giving much credence or weight to the context. And, when I sort of think about skill, for me, that's when sort of technique and context collide. And so to understand the context, there needs to be more information available for people to guide performance. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing with cricket at the moment is really sort of trying to shift this conversation from, a focus on technique in the activities to sort of thinking about things more holistically. And what are the problems that players need to solve in these situations where, they've got a context in front of them, right? So, and it's really interesting. I spend a lot of time talking with coaches, and, they talk about players who are really good technically, but then you put them out there on the center wicket and on a Saturday, and all of a sudden things fall down. And I think a big part of that is because they've really focused on the action side of things, but not the perception side of things, not building the relevant cues that they need to support problem solving into the environments that they're working in, right? And so, you get players who start to become robotic, less adaptable, fragile versus anti-fragile, however you want to put it, because they haven't got the whole picture. And I think one of the big challenges is, we're telling people that, okay, this is something that you need to be thinking about, without necessarily having a grid understanding of exactly what that looks like, and it's hard to sort of say, okay, we've been focusing on action, but perception's important. Go out and do it. It's like, how do we do that?
Fantastic. World of cricket. Give us some specific examples here, because I just think this is fascinating. And those listening in who prefer the world of baseball to cricket, there is some similarity there, right? So, in your work in cricket with cricket coaches, where you're starting to check and challenge them around turning action orientation, let's say in the cricket nets, to more perception action. Can you be specific with some of the experiences, some of the conversations you're having there?
Yeah, the nets is a great example. And so for the baseball folks out there, it's basically like batting cages and BP, right? And so it's sort of thinking, okay, well, we're doing throwdowns. So we're tossing balls at them. So they're responding to live balls, which is great. But the information that precedes that is really impoverished. So it's not sort of true to what they'd actually be responding to in a game situation. So, they're missing a piece there. And then there's also, I guess, a lot of this contextual stuff around the game. So like, where are the fielders positioned? What's the score in the game? What are the things that I need to be thinking about? That sort of then help people actually solve that problem, right? And so being able to be skillful means being able to not only execute at the moment, but being able to put all these other pieces around the stuff that they need to do in order to be more effective, right? So to get a holistic performance, it's not just about execution, it's about being able to read, anticipate, plan, adapt these other things that are sort of going on in the background. And so, one of the big challenges that we're sort of coming up on is like, okay, well, we've got to work in the nets because we don't have any other opportunity to do it. And my pushback on that would be, okay, well, why do we have to do that? Is it just a lack of grounds? And then if we are working in that environment, how do we make it so that we can squeeze more learning and development out of it and get more of a holistic development approach to it? And it's not necessarily saying, okay, well, we can't recreate the game in that situation, but what elements of the game then can we sneak in order to try and make it more realistic and create athletes who are more adaptable, more problem-solving oriented, those types of things.
And so what are some of the solutions there? Not being in the nets, going out onto the main pitch?
I think that's a big one. And sort of saying, okay, well, one of the big pushbacks sometimes in these sports is, okay, well, they're not going to get the volume and stuff that they need. And my argument against that is like, well, okay, well, if they're getting fewer repetitions, but the quality of those repetitions is much greater, then are we okay sacrificing some of these things? So, I kind of think if we're out there on the center wicket doing more problem-based activities, we're probably getting a little bit more return on investment than we are, and athletes have to be a lot more mindful in those situations. Whereas in the nets, there's an opportunity for them to sort of switch off and start becoming a little bit mindless. And so, obviously the great solution there is to go out and do more game-like work or games-based work, but that's not always an option. And so then the challenge then becomes, okay, well, how can I make the nets a little bit more gritty? How can I make it so that, they have to put shots in appropriate places? How can I put more context around the things that they're doing? And it's not an easy thing to think about, because we're kind of working against a lot of tradition there and having to go sort of think outside the box. But there's people who do interesting things in the sport already, and it's sort of thinking, okay, well, where can we go and look for ideas and steal some ideas from people to try and I guess get that little bit of extra punch that we need in those situations where we haven't really got other opportunities.
What ideas have you seen from cricket coaches?
That's a good one, and so like one of the things we can sort of focus on is thinking about like anticipation, right? So like obviously in cricket, there's this sort of like little one-on-one battle that happens in the lead up to the delivery, right? So changing the emphasis from, okay, I want you to execute a really beautiful cover drive, to think about, let's explore different cues here. We've got somebody coming towards us. Let's change the emphasis from a whole bunch of repetitions about the same physical action to let's try and explore what our vision's doing. Let's think about how we can plan things different way. Like cricket's a very strategic game, and so if I can put a challenge in front of the players in terms of a game scenario, and this is what you need to kind of put together over the next 6 deliveries, for example, put together an over. Then let's go out and have them do that and see how it works. Looking at how do you react and read different cues, right? So in order to develop holistic athletes, they've got to be able to respond and anticipate appropriately. Let's change the color of the ball and get them to respond to that. So we're sort of changing the emphasis from, physical repetitions to different things that are probably more relevant for these different aspects of the game, and almost gamifying in some ways, or switching the focus to perception.
It's interesting you used the word gamified, because it was the word that was traveling through my mind as you were speaking there. And I was thinking, I love what you were saying about, in the nets, maybe creating an over, for example, 6 balls, where maybe rather than the batsman practicing a specific stroke, there's some kind of gamification around having to identify the type of delivery that is about to be delivered, and maybe you have to use some kind of audio equipment here where the batsman has to actually announce or declare what the type of ball they think is going to be delivered to them, and maybe that audio is captured, and I don't know, there's a kind of a point system based on that rather than worrying too much about the execution. Or you could marry the execution with the declaration of the
Mm-hmm.
anticipation of the type of ball being bowled. Yeah, certainly gamification was running through my head in order to sort of direct and cultivate batsman attention onto the movements of the bowler with information sources that indicate the type of ball that's about to be delivered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and that's just sort of it. Again, it's just sort of shifting away from some of the more conventional things that people do. And I think, just kind of thinking outside the box a little bit, but really sort of taking the game as the guide and saying, okay, well, what are the problems people need to solve? What are the capabilities that they need to have to solve those? And, it's not just an execution thing. What are the other pieces? And there's this whole sort of other aspect of performance that we can start to work on and look at developing in those situations that, change the complexion of those kind of repetitive situations immensely in my mind.
It's really interesting what you're saying, 'cause it's making me think that the tension here lies in a volume versus contextual uh, sort of situation. It's
Mm.
just that socio-historical context of we feel we get better with volume, which is understandable, and to a
Yeah.
degree we do. But then what you're coming along and saying, well, hang on a minute, you're doing lots of volume and getting better at the game in a way, and certainly in a certain way. But when you take away so much information and contextually, you're robbing the player or
Mm.
players of that contextually rich information, then you know then that's why they're not transferring this out onto the pitch under pressure.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting too. And one of the questions I'll often get is from coaches is, okay, well, how much time should I be spending on the technical side of things versus the skill or problem based stuff that you're talking about? And so it's really interesting because they kind of think that the two are completely different, and they don't recognize that we're asking people to do a lot of the same technical stuff in those contextually rich environments, but it looks slightly different. It doesn't look as neat. And I think one of the things that we need to kind of get coaches in particular recognizing is that that's really good stuff. Essentially what you're doing in this environment here is you're creating a great space where you're almost sneaking the vegetables into the meal, right? Like, it's kind of thinking, okay, well, they are getting the good stuff in it, but it just looks a little bit different. It's not as neat. It's not as controlled. You're not going to have as much control about what it's looking at, but it's going to be better for them in the long run. And so I think that's another part where there's a fair bit of tension that I've sort of certainly experienced with a lot of the conversations I've had in the cricket world these days.
We've spoken quite a few times about contextual priors on the Sports Psych show. We've spoken to Dr. Oliver Rinswick, and also more recently to John Mackey from Island Canoe, and who's a coach of fighting sports. And very intrinsic to John's form of coaching is to set up a lot of contextual priors in training sessions. So finding opportunities to train his athletes in specific situations that they might find themselves going into a fight or within the fight itself. So it sounds to me like you would be very much promoting contextual priors, different scenarios, if you like, as something that's quite important from a holistic training perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I had an interesting conversation with somebody in the baseball world around that too, right? And so, if we're kind of getting somebody to sort of like chase perfect or do the same thing over and over again, they get really good at that and it looks really good. But what we're creating is almost like the fragile athlete, because once the opposition figures out how to break that bit down, they haven't got anything else to fall on. And so this idea of exposing people to lots of different situations and lots of different scenarios is to basically sort of create the anti-fragile athlete, where they're robust, they're able to respond, or maybe they've got the skills or the possible skills that allow them to respond in a lot of different ways. They maybe haven't built up this one skill in this one space very well, but they've got a really good landscape of capabilities that they can fall back on in these situations if they've been exposed to a lot of different scenarios. And we did a lot of fun work with the psychologists at the AIS around like pressure training, for example. And you've worked with athletes who are working in the big situations, and I always sort of say you can't recreate the pressure or anxiety or the tension that somebody's feeling when they're on the starting blocks in a gold medal final at the Olympic Games. But we can teach people that they have the capabilities to respond to that in different ways. And so I think that's a big part of being able to expose people to a lot of different scenarios, is almost to sort of give them these micro doses that sort of add up over time to this point where, okay, yeah, I'm pretty adaptable. I haven't seen this bowler before. I've heard he's pretty good, or I haven't seen this pitcher before. I haven't faced this team before. But I've got a lot of stuff that I can fall back on in that situation. And that's really, I think, what the big shift is trying to do. It's sort of thinking, okay, let's move from athletes who are really good trainers to athletes who are really good competitors and performers who can respond in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and to speak to what you've just said, I mean, we recently had Dr. Derek back on the Sports Psych show, and he said something similar, obviously speaking to penalty kicks and expertise in taking penalties. And, he said himself that people might suggest that you can't recreate the match day or the game day environment in training. But as he said, the evidence suggests it doesn't matter. I like your idea there of micro doses, that if you give players the opportunity to experience these scenarios, it gives you as a coach and a set of coaches the opportunity to upskill players, to have conversations with them, to think about these scenarios more broadly, and to upskill them with tools that help them to deal with these. So it doesn't have to necessarily completely reflect a game day environment, even if it just does a little bit more. That's enough, isn't it, Derek?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, one of the big questions I like asking coaches these days is, like, what makes a skillful athlete in your sport? And it's funny, very few of them talk about, athletes who are really good technically. They talk about ones who are great problem solvers, great decision makers. They're adaptable, they're resilient, those types of things. And so then the challenge that I sort of throw back on them is, okay, you're telling me all of these things are really important for the way you're performing. How do they show up in the environments that you're creating athletes to train and develop in? Because we know specificity is a thing. We know transfer of training is a thing. So what are you doing in the spaces that you're working in to promote these behaviors that you've just told me that are important? And I think that's a great starting point for coaches to sort of look at the alignment between, the things that they think are important, the things that they're actually doing, and how can we get those two closer together? So the perception and reality.
I love that question you ask coaches, and developing skilled players. How much of that do you think is in the session design, and how much of it is in the coach behaviors?
That's a really good question. I think I couldn't put a number on it, to be honest with you, because I think in the best situation is one where coaches can create an environment that does a lot of the talking for them, right? So it should have really really clear intentions. It should be, I guess, well designed in terms of the fact that it's got a clear problem sitting at the heart of it. And so I think that's really important. And then I think the coaching aspect is really then trying to think about, okay, well, do I need to adjust or change anything in the first instance? And then if I've got the environment right, then how do I poke and prod the athletes to sort of help them make the connections between the things that, I'm hoping that they'll get out of it, or maybe even things that I'm not expecting them to get out of it, but I'm seeing that they're doing well. So how do I then ask good questions around that? So in the first instance, I think the activity should ask a lot of the questions, but I think the coach has a big part of that as well, in terms of guiding the attention and nudging athletes in different directions along the way. So, I think both of them are really important. I think the balance in terms of a lot of the work that I've done watching coaches is that the emphasis probably gets put a little bit more on the coach-athlete interaction rather than the training structure. And so I think there's probably more opportunity to get some leverage and some returns out of that, the structure side of things. But I think they're both really important. And the emphasis is always going to be shifting and changing depending on where athletes are at and what they need at different times.
Really interesting. As you're speaking there, I'm thinking of the role of explicit instruction. I mean, there's a lot of debate as to, what instructional approaches are. Some people think they're very varied and broad and wide and defined in that manner, and others are more critical of that and consider instruction as telling somebody what to do. But if we think of explicit instruction, telling somebody what to do, and we think of our landscape of coaching practice, can that be involved in developing skill, telling somebody what to do? If we think of technique, we think of differences as we've highlighted between technique and skill. We think about, all of the contextual factors that go into playing a game. Where for you as a skill expert would you place a sort of an explicit instructional approach?
I think it's part of the coaching toolkit. I certainly think that it's something that coaches can lean on. I think when but it shouldn't be a default behavior, right? And I think one of the big challenges for coaches is seeing an athlete struggling through something and then feeling like they have to step in and help them. And that's when the explicit instruction comes in. And so my challenge that I sort of put to them is, when you see that happening and feel like you need to step in and tell somebody, give them a solution. Number one, are you robbing? If you do that, are you going to be robbing them of an opportunity to have some great learning? And if so, can we go down some different avenues? Are there different threads that we can pull on? And so, those threads in my mind are, can we change the activity in some way to sort of move towards, maybe the behaviors that we're looking for, or the outcomes that we're looking for, being able to solve that problem. And that can look a lot different depending on who the athlete is. So changing the activity, and then, can I guess, ask questions, get them thinking about how to connect the dots differently. So, using, I guess, the sort of nudging approach through different types of open questions to sort of see if they can connect those dots on their own. And then I sort of think, one of the last places to go would be the more explicit instruction. And it's not because I necessarily have any real qualms with it. It's just that, I guess, in my mind, I feel like that doesn't necessarily lead to robust learning, right? It's more of, if I've given them the answer, they can repeat it really quickly. And so, but if they can figure it out for themselves, I feel like that's going to be a little bit more deeply entrenched in terms of what they'll take away from that. And another interesting conversation I had recently was, is it okay to sort of leave the problem unsolved in sometimes, right? Like my thinking probably before I was asked that question was that, like we want to sort of come to a conclusion within a session or something like that, but maybe it's okay just to sort of leave that door open a little bit and come back to it in the next session that we're in, if they haven't figured out the solution, and there's some good reasons for that, giving them some space and, some time between that. They might consolidate and come up with answers that they're not able to think of on the spot. And it also creates coherence between different sessions. Like, I think we've got short memories when it comes to, training sessions. But if I've sort of left a door open here about a problem unsolved as a coach, that's something that I can come back to a little bit later on and create this, I guess, level of a golden thread that I can start to weave between different sessions to make sure that they're linked, and these intentions are kind of clearly established from one session to the next.
Listening to you, setting problems seems to lie at the heart of what you think could be efficacious coaching when it comes to helping players develop the cognitive perceptual side of things and the perception action side of things. Listening to you, it sounds like you might predominantly want coaches to develop skill through the activities that they create, those activities having some set problems within them. Listening to you, I'm hearing that you want to challenge coaches to change behavior by adapting activities more so than through their coach behaviors, their communication and so on, which isn't to suggest that they can't do it that way, but they might want to look at changing activities first. The learning process through all of this, how do we know as coaches when somebody has learned?
If I could answer that question, I'd probably be a very rich man. I think it's hard, and I think that's the ultimate thing. Like, I guess the best indicator in my mind is how they're performing in a competitive context, right? So, I think that for me is sort of the benchmark in terms of understanding whether or not we're getting where we need to go. I think it's an issue around learning in general, is that we can't see it happening in the moment. We have to sort of infer that learning is happening based on performance, and so we put somebody in a competitive situation. We need to start thinking of okay, well, getting really clear on what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. What would that look like in that competitive environment, and then collecting, almost thinking like a science, collecting multiple data points to sort of say, okay, well, I think we've got it. And one of the big challenges about sport is that, a lot of times there's pressure on coaches to get results, get things done now. And, they'll sort of see one performance and be like, okay, well, that didn't work. Let's go. We got to switch things up and change it around. So they tend to be a little bit, I think, too reactive in terms of what they're looking for to sort of say it. So, I think learning occurs when we see some consistency in behavior and adaptability in different situations, and the ability to, I guess, sort of stand up to the competitive pressures that they face. So for me, that's the ultimate benchmark. But again, it's really a really challenging thing to try and achieve.
And enormously challenging for a coach of team sports to notice and spot across the team.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you think there's much individual differences in terms of how players can acquire skill?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's another big challenge for coaches as well, is to make sure that they have a broad toolkit to draw from in order to help athletes in different ways. And so, I know there's a lot of discussion about, different theoretical approaches to coaching. And, I sort of think that, you've got to have a broad toolkit in order to be able to service different needs of different athletes and test things at different times, right? So, like I think great coaches are the ones that can adapt to their athletes, the ones who can respond or recognize what their athletes need, which is a hard skill, and respond in appropriate ways. And I think a big part of that, we talked about athletes exploring different things. I think a big part of that is almost like coaches exploring and practicing their craft as well. I don't think there's enough opportunities for coaches to go out there and explore and do things a lot of times because there's expectations on them for what they should be doing. And I think we need to try and change the conversation so that they're able to go out there and try things. And, again, this is one of the big things that I talk to coaches about is like, where are you taking the opportunity to go out there and explore and develop? Because the more you're developing, the more that you're going to be able to help each individual in different ways and respond to their needs. Because I think that's, at the end of the day, one of the really important parts of effective coaching is.
One of the things that struck me as particularly pertinent, and this is going to sound like the world's most obvious thing, but I don't know if everybody actually practices this, is to actually ask your athletes what their preferences are. That doesn't mean you can't check and challenge their preferences. Like, I know historically from some of the robust conversations I've had with various coaches or skill acquisition specialists who have preferred one style over another, or one theoretical underpinning rather than another one, is that when you sit down with players, a player might say, well, I just love it when you just tell me what to do. That really, really helps me, and it strips through all the noise. And I know that that's not necessarily preferable to the lens of some coaches. And again, respecting that you can always check and challenge that player, but ultimately listening to the people that we're coaching can be a very effective way to help them learn.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing to do. And I think one of the counter arguments to that is just because they think it's good doesn't mean that it's necessarily good. So I like that you sort of brought up this idea of being able to check and challenge that at the end of the day, because it's like, okay, well that's something you prefer, and then why do you prefer that? Because I remember working with a golf coach who was also sort of a player at the time as well, and she was sort of a really good amateur. And we were talking about explicit feedback, and she's like, sometimes I just want to be told. And it was like, okay, yeah, that's fair. And I think a reason why she wanted to be told was because she'd had a lot of coaches who'd told her what the solution was and didn't have to go through it. It wasn't as frustrating for her, and it's like, okay, that's fair enough, but what if we tried this another way? Or like, what are the different ways that we could look at this problem, and what are the potential outcomes or benefits for the athlete of looking at it different ways, right? So there's times where, as a coach, you've got to be explicit. You've got to say, okay, well, this is what you need. We don't have time to muck around. But there'll be other times where it's like, okay, no, I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm not going to give you that opportunity right now. We're sort of exploring and learning, and we're exploring and learning together. Let's go. So, it's a spectrum of behavior, and being able to, deploy the right tool at the right time, I think is critical.
You're making me think of the conversation I had about talent development pathways with Dr. Jamie Taylor, and that horrible term, epistemological chain, which is a horrible term for basically, well, just tell me about the history of your learning. How have you learned? Who have been your influences? Why are you doing what you're doing? What do you know about what you're doing? And actually probing into that can uncover some very interesting beliefs about how sport is done, or how one thinks their sport should be done.
Yeah. No, spot on. And, and you've probably had the same experience, but, there's a lot of stuff that, like when you come into a sport for the first time and you haven't really had experience with it or don't know it, as a Canadian moving to Australia, I got that a lot. But you see the sport and you're like, why are we doing this? and you start asking those questions. And I think it's fine if somebody can give you a good reason and a good rationale, but a lot of people haven't spent time thinking about why. Things kind of just get institutionalized, and then they get momentum, and then they just become the way we do it here, right? And so I think one of the big challenges and big opportunities for coaches is just to sort of take a step back and think, okay, well wait a minute, why am I doing this? Maybe there is a different way to approach this problem, rather than just going out and sort of doing the same thing we always do. And I think that can be a really fun, thought experiment, or, workshopping opportunity for coaches, is just to sort of play with ideas a bit more.
I think it's really interesting, Derek, because I'm thinking you as a skill acquisition consultant and sports coaching consultant, and myself as a sports psychologist and sports psychology consultant. And so much of our work is sense making and sense giving in environments that are a little bit unfamiliar to us. Like, we won't necessarily be an expert in the language of the sport that we're working in, or necessarily have a deep knowledge of the behaviors and the practices and the tactical plays of that sport. But we are in a great position, just like any outsider is, to check and challenge certain cultural norms and behavioral norms and stuck patterns of approaches, or stuck approaches that actually require sometimes checking and challenging. I think it's really an interesting landscape, and to speak to, it's interesting. Before we came on air today to have this conversation, you mentioned golf there, and working with a golfer, and obviously having a background in golf as a professional player and a coach. Sometimes I think that helps me when I work in golf, and it often helps me. Of course it does, but sometimes it hinders me, because you can be a little bit close to the sport. But I wrote a piece before we came on air today about, there's right now, as we're recording, the PGA at Wentworth in England is happening, and there was a bit of footage with Rory McIlroy talking to Gareth Bale, because it's the Pro-Am at the moment. So Gareth Bale being the soccer player, they were playing together, and Rory talking about how he likes to focus on the target and doesn't want really any technical thoughts. I'm paraphrasing him there, to be fair, but and I seriously question that external focus of attention, or the external distal focus of attention. Having a target, focusing on target, I don't think it gives us enough cognitive load. I think it can distract you in golf. Anyway, we won't go too deep into that. But the point being is, you're talking about one of the best players of all time, but I would want to feel comfortable to be able to respectfully check, if I was ever given the opportunity to respectfully check and challenge that focus of attention. He's got more talent in his left thumb than I have in my whole body. But, I think it's really interesting. Where does that come from? Why do you have to focus on the target? Why can't you have a couple of swing thoughts or feelings? Why can't you have an external proximal attention on the club head or on the shaft of the club? Why can't you have an internal focus of attention? I think this is interesting, especially for somebody who tends to look like they get distracted under pressure as well. So anyway, a bit, not a rant, but just going off on a bit of a tangent. But I think it's interesting to check and challenge what can be perceived as cultural norms.
Absolutely. And I would completely agree, right? And it's interesting, in some of the experience I've had in the NBA, like they talk about, like what motivates players, and it's sort of like a really carrot or stick approach is what the coaches would say. But you sit down and then you talk with some of the players, and, I had an opportunity to ask a two-time All-Star, what was his big driver for playing, and he talked about, his parents and wanting to make them proud. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, what would that look like on the practice court? What would that look like when you're playing a game? And that sort of thing, right? And so, I think that's another great example where, the common sentiment is, okay, well, this is what a driver of players is, but it's maybe not the reality for everybody. It's taking broad strokes. And, I sort of think, opening up the black box and starting to challenge those things is a really important piece of just kind of trying to be less wrong and figure things out. Like, I think that's one of the big things I've learned going from, I guess, more of the academic background, where I think things are a little bit more black and white, into the real world, for lack of a better word, of sport, and kind of recognizing that there's a million shades of gray. And, that there's lots of pressure on people, like athletes and coaches, to get things right all the time, and as much as I'd like to proselytize about doing things a certain way, sometimes my ideas aren't the thing that's going to stick with you. And so I need to challenge the things that I'm thinking about too. Right. And so it's this big, I guess, almost like reflective cycle. And I think the more we can get that right and be less wrong, the better off everybody's going to be.
Well, it's well said. And when one opens that black box, the challenge is that a world of complexity and nuance is thrown at you, escapes out of the box, and complexity and nuance doesn't make a particularly simple meme on social media. And so it's a difficult, it's a challenging sell, but that's the reality of it.
Yeah. Is it a black box or Pandora's box? Maybe, I don't know.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, you open the black box and it ends up being Pandora's box. But look, people like yourself are so important in this world, because when coaches are willing to open that black box, they do understand that it becomes a world of complexity. And again, it comes back to sense making, sense giving. And look, I can't thank you enough for the last hour of sense making and sense giving around skill acquisition and coaching behaviors and coaching science in general. It's been really, really interesting. And I know that you will have tapped the interest of those listening in. So how can people find you, follow you, and get in touch?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for creating this platform and creating the opportunity to sense make with one another. I think that's really important, and really enjoy the opportunity as well. You pulled on some interesting threads. And so people want to reach out to me. It's basically Derek Panchuk on all of the socials. I think my website is www.derekpanchuk.com. Not a whole lot happens there. But if you want to get in touch with me, you can find me there. But LinkedIn, pretty active on that, as well as Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it these days, for better or worse. Always interested in connecting with new people who are interested in talking about these ideas. I extend the invitation to any coach to reach out and chat with me. Very few take me up on the offer, but those who do, I find that we tend to learn a lot from one another along the way.
Well, that's fantastic. And Derek, I can't thank you enough for your time today. So thank you so much.
Thanks again, Dan.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast episode, and I hope you did too. I'd really like to know any ideas that you have for me. So if you do have some ideas, please do get in touch via X or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do so, I'd be delighted to hear from you. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.